I do my best teaching out in the field. Our students, our alumni, come alive in a really different way when we're out together in nature. We'll talk about how to do that together at the end of my presentation. Right now, we're going to go on an armchair adventure to a place that you probably haven't thought about very much, and that's the deep ocean. Our oceans cover 71% of the planet. It's why NASA coined the term the blue marble during Apollo 17. But we don't actually know much about them. Only 3% of the deep sea floor has been explored. Here's a group of ladies taking tea, and one of them asks, or says, "I don't know why I don't care about the bottom of the ocean, but I don't." And it's ironic, but those of us that work there, we loved even getting this kind of a shout out from the New Yorker. So it's off our radar screen. That's one of the problems. But there's weekly discoveries that come out of the deep sea. How about this one? 2 weeks ago, scientists found the jacuzzi of despair. It's 1,000 meters down below the surface of the Gulf of Mexico. It's a brine pool full of poisonous gases, and it kills all animals that approach. Now, bizarre conditions like that foster really unusual forms of life. We think there's somewhere between 1 and 10 million distinct species in the ocean, and we found fewer than half in probably less than 10%. My groups dove to the bottom of the ocean in the Pacific over 35 times now, and we've come back from every trip with species that are unknown to science. And we're not talking like insects in the rainforest. These are big animals, they're colorful animals, they're like these corals, anemones, and deep sea sponges. Now, the deep sea, it's also important for climate. It's the largest exchangeable reservoir of heat on the planet. So whenever the Earth warms up or cools down, the deep ocean's always involved. It's also the largest reservoir that's currently taking anthropogenic CO2 out of the atmosphere. So there's many biogeochemical reasons why we want to understand the deep sea. But what about that fish? That's a goosefish, and it's got little fins that act like legs, allowing it to squat, and its whole body is covered with little whiskers. Now, I'm really interested in the undersea mountains that never see the light of day. There's over 100,000 of these throughout the world, and 50,000 of them in the Pacific alone. And the crazy thing is that half of those have been discovered in the last decade, right? So we study the seamounts because they're areas where there's an abundance of life. They attract and support all kinds of interesting deep sea fauna. These are areas where the ocean currents interact with the rocky substrate. One of the keystone species there are deep sea corals. These are animals that grow up to heights of several meters. They can live for centuries to millennia, and they often form great forests on the flanks of seamounts. Here's a bamboo coral. It's called that because of these kind of white carbonate bony bits that are connected to the rest of the coral through these black protein knuckles that allow it to flex in the currents down deep. Deep sea corals also provide habitat space for many other kinds of organisms. This is the pink bubblegum coral from the deep sea off of Alaska. It's about 3 meters tall, and when we poked it with the manipulator arm of our submarine, thousands of other creatures jumped ship, right? These animals are living up in the canopy of the forest where there's a little bit more oxygen in the deep sea. Now, I started this work about 20 years ago. I wanted to take the temperature of the ocean where it counts most, down in the ocean interior. And the thinking was, let's get some century-old corals, study their chemistry, and figure out how to use that to understand climate change through time. We're still doing that. That's a whole nother talk. I got sidetracked, though, when I discovered exactly how old these organisms could be. Here's a coral that's over 3,000 years old. It's just under 15 feet tall. There's a little submersible for scale. We're going to dive in that sub in just a moment. How do we know how old these animals are? Well, like trees on land, they often form growth rings. So we take a cross-section through a branch or a stump. We study those rings. We figure out the oldest part, the youngest part, and then we use isotopic clocks like radiocarbon to tell us exactly how old they are. Now, why does this matter? Honestly, for me, part of it is just the sheer wonder of these large, colorful creatures that live for thousands of years down in the deep, dark ocean. But there's a conservation angle as well. These are endangered species, right? They're harvested for jewelry, but the biggest take of deep sea corals by far is unintentional bycatch from benthic trawl fisheries. So fisheries target seamounts because that's where the fish are. And the fish are there in part because of these forest communities that support larval and juvenile fish. And I think you can see where this is going, right? If it takes thousands of years for these fish nurturing communities to develop, it's probably not a good idea to engage in fishing practices that remove the forest. So we're going to go on a short dive now. We're going to go to Brooks Bank in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands. You can see the big island there on the lower right and Midway in the upper left. Brooks Bank is right in the middle. It's a 16,000-foot tall undersea mountain. State of California there outlined for scale. These submersibles are designed to keep 2 to 3 people comfortable under conditions of tremendous pressure. So 2 to 3 scientists get inside that 7-foot diameter sphere. That's the only protected part of the vessel. The rest is propulsion systems, buoyancy control, ballast, that kind of thing. And we dive for anywhere from 8 to 16 hours. And there is no bathroom. So here's a typical day for a launch in the Northwest Pacific. The 3 scientists are inside. It takes about 20 minutes to launch a submarine like this and perform all the safety checks. We look out at the world through these 6-inch portholes, right? And they have to withstand great pressure, so the plastic in those portholes is 6 inches thick. We've got ways to communicate with the mothership. The mothership always keeps track of where we are. That's how we do our navigation.
C5 passing 1,300 meters, over.
So here we are passing 1,300 meters on our way to touchdown 2,000 meters over a mile deep. And we've touched down on the flank of Brooks Bank. Now, no matter where you touch down on a Pacific seamount, and there's 50,000 of them, you'll see something like this. You start seeing these ancient coral forests right away. There's many different species there, at least 40 macro species in every frame. And it's just like the rocky intertidal. The surface is completely covered with life. It's refugia for fish. The fish can hide from predators. Lots of fish actually come down into the deep sea for food. And so we see lots of shallow species moving as deep as 1,000 meters, and then they return some of that food back up to the surface. It's a new angle to the food chain. Here's an anemone taking advantage of some of this high flux of food from surface waters into the deep. And here are the deep sea coral forests. So this particular forest goes on for about 10 acres. All of those corals are 2,000 to 3,000 years old. Right? And they're just chock full of fish. This is the Hawaiian pink coral. It's how the Hawaiian pink jewelry is made. This guy's not quite as old, but they can be as old as 1,000 years. If you look up close on these things, they're like jellyfish on a stick. Little jellyfish, little sea anemones that live together in a colonial fashion. That's also a pink coral. It looks pretty white here, but there they are, thousands of little anemones living together and making that skeleton that's over 1,000 years old. This is a deep sea sponge over 4 meters tall. It's made a little basket that's trapped all kinds of other organisms, like that little squat lobster. Now, this is the oldest coral that we've sampled yet. This coral was almost 6,000 years old. It's still alive today because we knew that it was a Methuselah coral, and we simply pruned off one of the branches. I have that in my office, and honestly, if any of you want to make an appointment to come by and see this thing, please do so. It's a very interesting specimen. Now, if you grew up playing video games, you already know how to operate those manipulator arms. Otherwise, it takes a lot of practice so you don't destroy or damage the submarine. Here's a big sponge, 1 meter across at the top there at the basket, and then it's held to a vertical wall by this 3-meter-long stalk. Well, all adventures come to an end, right? We come back up to the surface. On this particular dive, we came back with 200 pounds of fossil corals. These are deep sea corals that were alive 20,000 years ago during the last great ice age. And we're using those now to figure out what was different about planet Earth when there was a big ice sheet. And that helps us figure out what's going to happen next when the ice sheets melt. So that's our short dive. The takeaway message is there's an amazing world beneath the surface of the sea if you ever get a chance to go.